When it comes to beefing up their defensive front, the Falcons cannot afford to sit out free agency.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are beginning what should be an ongoing series for the rest of the week, talking about the very many free agent options for the Falcons, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Maybe we'll get into some of the offensive options, particularly at the center and maybe tight end positions later in the week. But today we're focusing on that front, right? And we'll talk about the other various groups, but today it's all about the edges. It's all about the D-line, right? And, you know, the hope I have for this Falcons team as they go into this offseason is that they're looking to add 4 players to their defensive front this offseason. Hopefully 2 edges, 2 interior D linemen. And hopefully that will be 2 guys that come in free agency at each position, 1 at each, and then 2 guys in the draft, 1 at each. But I think the Falcons need to be aggressive in free agency or proactive in free agency. That's a better term, right? Because I don't think you can trust the draft to solve your defensive front issues, right? We know that the draft is a crapshoot, and I think far too often, because people, I'm not going to go on a mock draft simulator rant today, but I think far too often people look at these mock draft simulators and think it's very easy to manipulate the board, and you easily can walk away from the draft looking at, solving these needs. But the flaw in that is because mock draft simulators are based off of one board, right? They have algorithms that try to introduce variance into these simulations. But in the real world, in the real draft, there's 32 different boards, and it's much more variable, much more unpredictable. And therefore you cannot trust that, hey, we're going to be able to solve all of our problems via the draft. And so therefore I think you have to get those issues resolved in free agency, right? If we're talking about what Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta talks about, getting that immediate impact defender, that's a free agent. That's not a draft pick. A draft pick, maybe, again, you'll be lucky if you get a Jared Verse that comes in year 1 and is an immediate impact player, especially in this year's class. I don't think there is a Jared Verse in this year's class outside of Abdul Carter, right? And more than likely, if you do rely on the draft, that player is not going to produce and be that impact player until his 2nd or 3rd year. If you're the Falcons, you can't afford to wait that long. And that doesn't mean that we don't draft the player, but if you want to make a difference in 2025, free agency is the path to go. And we talked about this yesterday on the podcast, where if you're looking to get this pass rush to potentially 40 sacks, which is where you need to be quote unquote playoff caliber, you're potentially needing to add 15 to 20 sacks to the current group of players that you have. And you cannot trust in draft picks to be able to provide all that level of production, right? You need ready-made free agents to do that. And not to mention, signing free agents gives you a lot more flexibility when it comes to the draft, right? We look at this first round where everybody's expecting the Falcons to take an edge rusher, and they definitely will take an edge rusher with that pick. There's no possibility that they'll go in another direction, of course, wink, wink. But, there's 6 edges that most people think are in, play for the Falcons at pick 15. That's Mykel Williams of Georgia, Shamar Stewart of Texas A&M, Donovan Ezeraku of Boston College, Mike Green of Marshall, James Pierce Jr. of Tennessee, and Jalen Walker of Georgia, right? And, Williams and Stewart, every down players, 4-3 defensive ends, whatever, no worries about what they can do in terms of first and second down. But the other 4 guys, Ezeraku, Green, Pierce, Walker, I think there are legit questions on whether or not those guys can play every single snap. Now, opinions will vary on that front, but that's notable because Jeff Ulbrich, the Falcons' new defensive coordinator, went through the same exact issue with Will McDonald, who the Jets took with the 15th overall pick 2 years ago. And Will McDonald being an undersized defensive end, that led to issues this past year with the Jets and asking him to be an every down player, and he became a liability against the run. The Falcons, if you go way back in the time machine to 2012, right, when the Falcons, Was that the last? No, that's not the last playoff game they won. But go back to 2012 when they played the Seattle Seahawks, right? The week before they played them in the divisional playoff round, Seattle lost their starter, Chris Clemens, to an injury, and they were forced to play their first round pick. It may have been a 15th overall pick, and Bruce Irvin, another undersized defensive end, full time. And you know what the Falcons did? They ran it down Seattle's throat. The Falcons' run game was DOA for weeks leading up to that playoff game. And all of a sudden, Michael Turner and Jacquizz Rodgers came alive because basically Tyson Clabo was absolutely annihilating Bruce Irvin every single snap. And so you don't want to be in a situation that the Jets found themselves in, the Seahawks found themselves in, and so many other teams have found themselves in, where you're using a first-round pick on a player, this undersized edge rusher, that is basically unplayable for 60% of your snaps because he's not good enough against the run. That when you put him out on the same field as Jordan Mailata and Christian Darrisaw and Trent Williams and Penei Sewell and Tristan Wirfs and Ike Ekwonu, right? Those guys are bodying him, and you're basically like, we cannot play him. And so you want to have the flexibility that if you are going to target one of these questionable undersized guys, you need to have a built-up defense, right? The Jets had that in 23. They had a top 5 defense, a top 5 defensive front. And so they could throw a Bryce Huff, a Will McDonald into the mix as situational pass rushers because you didn't need them to be every down football players. But this past year, with injuries and attrition leading to, Huff out the door, Jermaine Johnson hurt, John Franklin Myers, they took that hit. And all of a sudden, Will McDonald's issues became a major issue for the Jets, right? And, again, I know this falls on deaf ears for Falcon fans because we only care about pass rush. We only care about sacks. And, right, you look at Will McDonald, how can you say, Aaron, Will McDonald was bad? He had 10.5 sacks this year, right? But the Jets defense was worse, right? And, these things matter, though, when it talks about building a complete defense, not just, hey, we need a guy that can get sacks. Right. You see that with the Philadelphia Eagles. They went out and spent all the money on Bryce Huff this offseason, but he was unplayable on that defense in the second half because he couldn't hold up against the run. And he basically made almost no contributions to their Super Bowl run. They just wasted that money. Now, Philly was able to get away with it because they have a good defensive line to overcome that issue. The point I'm trying to make is the Falcons do not have that yet. Right. They're hoping to build that sort of situation if that situation arises with one of these undersized edge rushers in the draft. But in order to build that, you have to build it first in free agency, right? You need to find that sort of certainty and that depth in free agency, not just rely on draft picks to do it. So, I had a Locked On Falcons insider hit me up after yesterday's episode when I talked about, the need for the Falcons to upgrade their pass rush. And he was like, Aaron, you thoroughly depressed me, right? I thought I was looking for the light at the end of the tunnel, and now I'm depressed. And my goal was not with yesterday's episode to depress you guys. My goal is to try to express the sense of urgency that is required for this Falcon football team to solve some of these problems, particularly the ones up front. So with that in mind, now that you understand how important it is that the Falcons are proactive in the next week or two, as free agency kicks off next week, let's break down some of the edges that they realistically could be adding in that time as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So you've probably heard of Chewy, and they really do have everything you need to keep your pet happy and healthy. Whether you're shopping for food, treats, or even pet healthcare, Chewy makes it fast, easy, and affordable. With over 100,000 products from all your favorite brands, Chewy has everything you need that your pet needs, from food and treats to toys, beds, and grooming. And it's not just for dogs and cats. They got supplies for birds, fish, reptiles, and even small pets too. I even saw, they got llama supplies. So if you got a llama in your background, save the drama for your llama. Chewy's got you covered. So Chewy's going to make it easy to manage your pet's health with prescriptions, telehealth vet visits, and even in-person vet clinics rolling out nationwide. And their auto ship is a game changer. You can set up automatic deliveries for food, treats, and any essentials so that you never ran out, and you can change or cancel at any time. Chewy has everything you need to keep your pet healthy and happy. Right now, you can save $20 on your first order and get free shipping by going to chewy.com or clicking the link in the description below. Save $20 on your first order with free shipping by clicking the link in the description. Minimum purchase required. New customers only. Terms and conditions apply. See site for complete details. So we're revisiting something that we talked about on this podcast roughly 3 weeks ago, talking about the different tiers of edge rushers available in free agency. And I've had a list of 30 guys that are in 5 different tiers. We had 4 in that previous episode. Now we've added a 5th one and whatnot. And I came up with a very rough score to kind of grade these guys and rank these guys, right? It's based off of their combined pass rush production over the last 2 years. Because again, there's a reason why we only care about sacks, right? And pressures and all that stuff. And I compared that to what Arnold Ebiketie's pass rush production has been over the last 2 years. And I use 6 different metrics from PFF, right? Their win rate, their pressure rate, and their knockdown rate. Now, knockdowns meaning sacks and combined sacks and hits. And I looked at those 3 metrics in both on their regular snaps and their true pass sets, right? That's where we get the 6 from. And true pass sets is the PFF data that removes like screens and play action and rollouts and quick throws and 3-man rushes to try to find true pass rushing situations for those guys. And basically I figured if these guys are better than Arnold Ebiketie or similar or than Arnold Ebiketie, and came up with a score on a 0 to 100 scale, with 100 basically meaning that you were better than Arnold Ebiketie in all 6 areas, 0 meaning that you were worse than him in all 6 areas, 50 would basically mean that you were roughly similar to Arnold Ebiketie in all those 6 metrics, right? And, the higher the score, the more productive you are, better than Arnold Ebiketie. And the reason why I use that is because we all kind of recognize Arnold Ebiketie as a capable pass rusher, but this past year, he was kind of forced to be that number 1 pass rusher for the team, or maybe number 2 if you put Kane Ellis as the number 1. And I, and also you, believe that if this pass rush is going to make serious strides this upcoming season and into the future, you'd much rather have Arnold Ebiketie not as your number 1 or number 2, but as your maybe number 3 or number 4 type of guy. And so that's the idea of, are you better than Arnold Ebiketie? So therefore, you're in theory could be the new number 1 or the new number 2. And so when we're breaking these guys down, we're breaking them down into 3 broad categories, right? Borrowing from comics, you got the Batmans, you got the Robins, you got the Alfreds, right? The Batman is the number 1 guy for obvious reasons. The Robin is that sidekick, that number 2 guy, right? The Alfred is just another guy. He's in the support role. He's back in the Batcave, lending his support, right? If you're following the analogy. But we know that Batmans don't regularly hit the free agent market, almost never hit the free agent market. So, ideally what you're really trying to get in free agency is sort of that high level Robin, right? We call them Nightwings here on this podcast, right? That when Batman leaves town, Gotham still needs someone to protect them. And, to your low level street toughs, Nightwing and Batman, it's not a whole lot of difference, right? Now against the Joker, maybe Nightwing is going to leave you a little bit desired when it comes to supervillains and whatnot. And so that's kind of how it breaks down. But looking at these various tiers, that tier 1 is the high-level Robins. There's 3 guys on that tier. For me, that's Khalil Mack, who scored a 94 on this 100-point scale. Josh Sweat, a 78. Chase Young, a 72, right? Then we have the tier 1.5, right? And basically, these were the guys that were once upon a time, at one point in their career, were a Batman or a Robin, but now they're on the decline. Joey Bosa, who's potentially a cap cut, scored an 83. Hassan Reddick was a 61. Von Miller, who's a potential cap cut, scored a 56. Leonard Floyd, another potential cap cut, at 56. DeMarcus Lawrence is a 50. And our friend Matthew Judon is lowly 11. The production these last couple of years has not been great for Matthew Judon, in part due to injuries. And, if Matthew Judon would have you tell it, Jimmy Lake. But tier 2 is really where the guys that have the upside to be the Robin, but just really haven't proven it yet. They're the sidekicks in training, right? And this is the tier that I think you're going to get the most bang for your buck, right? This is the tier you want to shop in. And one of 2 players that scored 100 that were better than Arnold Ebiketie across these metrics was Malcolm Koonce, scored 100. Azeez Ojulari and Josh Uche both scored 61. Baron Browning was a 56. Dayo Odeyingbo was a 44. And Cam Sample was an 11. Now, the new tier we added was the tier 2.5, right? These are the guys that have Robin upside, but have major injury red flags. The 2 players on this tier would be Marcus Davenport, who scored an 89, very productive, but basically, in the 6 games he's played over the last 2 seasons, but has only played 6 games the last 2 seasons. Charles Omenihu was a 0, just his production has fallen off a cliff since he left San Francisco a couple of years ago. And then we have tier 3. These are the Alfreds, right? And there's a qualitative difference between old Alfred and young Alfred and whatever you want to get into, if you want to get into your comic book lore or whatever. But these guys are mostly low-end starters, rotational pieces. And the other player that scored 100 was Dennis Gardeck, a fun player for the Arizona Cardinals, a very productive backup and limited role over the last couple of years. Jacob Martin, 94. Michael Hoecht and Derek Barnett were 61s. DeMarcus Walker and Joseph Osai were 50s. Darrell Taylor and K'Lavon Chason were 33s. Sam Hubbard, a potential cap cut, was a 28. Chauncey Golston and Joe Tryon Shoyinka were both 22s. Harold Landry, another potential cap cut, is an 11. So I don't want to hear anybody talking about the Falcons signing Harold Landry. He's basically a poor man's Matthew Judon. Been there, done that. And then the pit legend, Patrick Jones II, also scored in 11. So I think the best bet that you can make is shopping in that tier 2. As I referred to it a couple of weeks ago, you're looking for the next Shaq Barrett, right? He was a tier 2 player when he hit free agency in 2019 after 4 years as a backup, a very productive, and those underlying PFF metrics would have told you, hey, this guy's extremely productive in a limited role playing behind Von Miller and Shane Ray for those 4 years in Denver. He winds up signing a 1 year, $4 million deal with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, leads the NFL in sacks in 2019, and cashes in and went on to have very productive years for the next several years with Tampa Bay, helping them win a Super Bowl. And so that's what you're kind of hoping for if you're the Falcons. You're trying to look for the next Shaq Barrett. And, you know, to me, the best bet that you can make to be that next Shaq Barrett is probably Malcolm Koonce. Now, Malcolm Koonce just missed this last season with an ACL tear. But he had a very good 2023. That's where all that production comes from. He was basically the Robin to Max Crosby with the Raiders in 2023. And so you're betting on his potential to do it again. I think he's probably the best bet that you can make. And that's a worthwhile bet for the Falcons. And, you know, I think because he's coming off an injury, you could probably get him on a short-term deal with limited guarantees. I know PFF is projecting him on a 2-year, $37.5 million, so almost $19 million a year with $20 million in guarantee. I'm not convinced that his market is going to be that robust. I've seen other projections that are more in that like 1 year, $9 to $15 million range. And I think that's probably a little bit more accurate, but we'll see. Now, that being said, I'm not particularly optimistic that the Falcons will go after a Malcolm Koonce type player, because typically we know under Terry Fontenot, since he's been the GM over the last 4 years, that the free agents that the Falcons have typically targeted have been guys that have previous connections to their coaching staff and or their front office, right? There's been a couple of exceptions in that time, notable free agents that I'm not talking about like only these guys, but of the sort of notable signings that the Falcons made. Calais Campbell was a guy that didn't have a connection. Charlie Warner was another guy. Mike Davis was another guy. But for the most part, most of their signings that they have made with guys that were expected to be starters or they were given multi-year contracts had previous connections to this coaching staff. Now, Tim Burbinik, who's the Falcons game management coach, much under fire after that Washington game, did coach with the Raiders during Malcolm Koonce's rookie season. He was the running backs coach back then. So not a whole lot of interaction with Malcolm Koonce, but at least there's a little bit of a connection there. But when you look at the players that they do have connection to, you look at the Ryan Pace connection. He traded for Khalil Mack when he was the GM in Chicago. Kyle Smith, who was running the Washington drafts when they drafted Chase Young, right? Raheem has connections to Michael Hoecht and Von Miller and Leonard Floyd from his days with the Rams DC. Nate Ollie, the new Falcons D-line coach. Coach Josh Sweat when he was in Philadelphia as an assistant D-line coach. Coach Jacob Martin in multiple places. Deo Odiningbo in Indianapolis, and Derek Barnett, I believe, in Houston and Philadelphia. And Jeff Ulbrich, of course, most recently coached Hassan Reddick with the Jets. Terry Fontenot was in New Orleans when they drafted Marcus Davenport, and you can even call a Jimmy Lake connection when it comes to Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, since they overlapped in Washington, even though Jimmy Lake is no longer gone. You, of course, have the Georgia guys, Cam Sample, Leonard Floyd, Azeez Ojulari, all are local guys from the state of Georgia. So if I was guessing on what the Falcons would likely do, you know, I think all three of those tier 1 guys, Mack, Chase Young, and Josh Sweat, have connections. So in theory, they're plausible, but because of the amount of money you're likely to spend on those guys, I don't necessarily expect the Falcons to be shopping there. I wouldn't be shocked if we're going to tier 1.5. The one guy I would probably circle would probably be Leonard Floyd, to maybe potentially act, you know, sort of homecoming, act as a mentor to whoever the Falcons draft in round 1 for 1 year and then move on from Leonard Floyd at that point. If they're going to go in tier 2, their connection to Azeez Ojulari, given the homecoming from the University of Georgia, probably is the most plausible bet out of that tier 2. But I tend to have low expectations. As I often say, you know, you set your expectations low, and then just maybe, the Atlanta Falcons will not disappoint you. And so for that reason, I'm going into next week expecting only the Falcons to sign like a tier 3 guy, right? And then they're just going to put their trust in the draft to go their way. And if I was to guess on which tier 3 guy they would target, it would be Michael Hoecht from the Rams. You know, I think when you look at this list of individuals, you know, some of these guys are 3-4 guys. Some of these guys are 4-3 guys. I think some of these guys have scheme versatility. Hoecht would be one. Koonce, I think, also could play in either scheme. You know, I think the tier 1 guys, Khalil Mack, Josh Sweat, Chase Young, you know, they have experience playing in 4-3s and 3-4s. So they're good. I think the rest of that group, for the most part, at least in the realistic expectations. Most of those guys are either 3-4 guys or 4-3 guys. So I do think if the Falcons do sign some of those guys that aren't necessarily as scheme versatile, it will give us a hint on what type of scheme the Falcons are going to run. Again, they say they're going to be multiple. I'm assuming they're going to be lean more towards a 3-4, but they could, of course, go towards a 4-3. Now, you're probably sitting here wondering, Aaron, are you going to be this thorough when we do the rest of the position breakdowns? I'm looking forward to that. And I'm going to be like, no, I'm not going to be. For obvious reasons, the Falcons have an evergreen need at the edge rusher position, so I think it merits a little bit more of a deep dive. Other positions, not so much, but we will, we will be thorough, just not as thorough, breaking down 30 guys into different tiers, outside of the edge rusher position. We'll probably look at like 10 to 15 guys at other positions if it merits it. But that being said, we'll do our best to break down those other position groups, including the interior defensive line and which options are available as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. And mainly we'll focus coming up on those guys that do have those coaching and or front office connections as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So there are 9 impending free agents that have played for either Jeff Ulbrich, Raheem Morris, or Nate Ollie. We're focusing on those 3 guys. And then there are 2 potential cap cuts that also, have those connections. Those 2 cap cuts are Denico Autry and Javon Hargrave. Autry played for Nate Ollie this past year with Houston, was not particularly productive, but spent many years being very productive with the Colts and Titans in previous years. But he's like 35 at this stage. Maybe he's got one more year left in the tank. Javon Hargraves has not been nearly as successful in San Francisco since he left Philadelphia, but did play for Nate Ollie when he was assistant D-line coach there back in, I think, 2020. And obviously these guys have been very highly productive pass rushers in the past. They would probably qualify as tier 1.5 guys, at least on the interior D-line, on the decline, getting up there in age. I don't necessarily expect the Falcons to pursue either one of them because you argue they already have a similar player in Grady Jarrett. Why would you add another? I would be doubtful of that. But the 9 free agents, I think you can put in 2 broad buckets. Some of these guys are primarily pass rushers. Some of these guys are run stuffers. The pass rushers would be Quentin Jefferson, who played 1 year with the Jets, Sheldon Rankins, who spent 2 years with the Jets, and then this past year in Houston with Nate Ollie. Solomon Thomas spent 3 years with the Jets, and Javon Kinlaw spent this past year with the Jets. The run stuffers would be Foley Fadakasu, who did play for the Jets in 21 when Jeff Ulbrich and Nate Ollie were both there, and then this past year in Houston. Sebastian Joseph-Day was the Rams nose tackle during that Super Bowl run in Raheem Morris's first year in 2021. The guy that replaced him was a backup to Joseph Day and then replaced him in 2022 was Greg Gaines. Lecky Fotu spent this past year with the Jets. And then you have Bobby Brown, who spent the last 3 years playing that nose tackle spot with the Rams, or spent all 3 years. He spent 4 years with the Rams, 3 of them with Raheem Morris there. So my expectation, if the Falcons do go interior D-line, they're going to sign a run stuffer. Right, they're going to sign someone to basically fill the Eddie Goldman-sized void in the middle of their defense to play that nose spot, regardless of whether they stick with a 3-4 or 4-3. Obviously, if it's more of a 4-3 look, that maybe that guy's going to be less of a true solely run plugger and bringing you a little bit more juice as a pass rusher, hopefully. But we'll see on that. Now, if they do wind up signing that run plugger, that I think that does give you flexibility to go in either direction in the draft. You can, take a swing on another run plugger, or you can draft the pass rusher hoping to add another body into the mix to be that long-term replacement for Grady Jarrett on the interior, where, betting on Ruke Aurora, betting on Brandon Doss, and betting on another sort of early round pass rushing D tackle. To me, like, the odds are one of these guys is going to hit, the odds are pretty high that at least one of those guys is going to hit and give you Grady Jarrett like production at some point in the future. But we'll see on that front. So if you don't sign a free agent D tackle, I think then you're going to be forced to have to find that run plugger in the draft. And that likely means you're going to wait till day 3. And then, circumstances could dictate that you won't be able to get around to that pick until round 7. And maybe this draft class is certainly deep enough at D tackle where that would probably be a better bet. A round 7 D tackle in this year's class may be a better bet than the round 7 D tackle in most years' classes. But do you really want to rely on a late round guy that's going to have to play 25 or 30 snaps like we often saw Eddie Goldman playing this past year? Not particularly. So if the Falcons are going to go outside their wheelhouse in terms of finding guys that don't necessarily have coaching connections and focusing primarily on guys that are under the age of 30, because I do think one of the goals for the Falcons is to get younger, right, at that D tackle position, given the age of Onyemata and Grady Jarrett. And of course, if you're confused, I'm assuming that David Onyemata is going to get cut. Grady Jarrett's status moving forward is up in the air, but I think it's likely that he'll be retained. For those that don't know, we've been talking about that for 2+ months. But two pass rushers that are outside their wheelhouse are Levi Onwuzurike from Detroit. And we'll see what his price tag is. Osa Odighizuwa was probably the top interior pass rusher outside of Milton Williams, and he just got paid $20 million by the Cowboys on an extension. So that's going to push up his market. We already thought Milton Williams was going to get that type of money. So we'll see with that with Onwuzurike. You got Tershawn Wharton for the Chiefs, had a very productive year. Maybe the sack numbers are a little bit misleading from what I've read and what I've seen, but we'll see. And then you have the run plugger and Tier Tart from the Chargers. He had some issues that led to his ousting in Tennessee, but was very good this past year as part of that Chargers rotation. Had a very good game going up against Drew Dalman and company in that post-bye week game this past year. And so if I'm circling one guy that I would bet money on that the Falcons would pursue out of all those guys I've named, it would probably be Bobby Brown from the Rams, right? He's very limited as a pass rusher, but a good run plugger. He's young. He's only going to be 25 this August, right? And he should be relatively cheap. I would be shocked, even if on a multi-year deal, he would average anything more than like $4 or $5 million a year. If that was the case, and it could be like half that or a third of that type of money, depending on the market and whatnot. And so he recently expressed his displeasure with his limited role as a solely run plugger on Twitter with the Rams. And so is clearly looking for a bigger opportunity to be more of an every down guy elsewhere. And could he find that in Atlanta? I think that's certainly a possibility. But if I was a betting man, I would probably bet on some sort of Rams reunion, picking up guys like Michael Hoecht and Bobby Brown this offseason to bolster this defensive front. I don't think either one of those signings are really going to solve the Falcons' problems, but it does, add some decent proven producers in this defensive scheme under Raheem Morris, and does give you some of that flexibility that you're looking for in the draft. But there's hoping, that the Falcons may aim a little bit higher than that. Two guys that I would probably call tier 3 sort of guys based off of how we're breaking this down. And you maybe get some guys that are maybe a little bit higher upside, Koonce. And if we're going for the run plugger, Tier Tart, I think, I think he's going to bring you a little bit more juice as a pass rusher, at this stage in his career. So those would probably be the two guys that I think are realistic signings. Again, obviously, if we're playing with fake money and monopoly money and whatnot, it's like, oh, we're spending all the money on Josh Sweat. We're spending all the money on Khalil Mack. We're going out there and we're signing Levi Onwuzurike, and we're signing Poona Ford, and we're going ham this offseason in sort of the dream scenario. But I don't think that's a realistic dream for where the Falcons are at this stage. But I would love to sit here on this podcast next week, guys, and be proven wrong, and see this team being very much more aggressive than I'm giving them credit for at this current stage. So we'll see what they do on that defensive front. We'll talk more about the linebackers, and if I do think the linebacker position is one where it's setting up potentially for the Falcons. If they're going to make a big splash this offseason, it may be at linebacker, it may be in the secondary. So those will be topics potentially coming up on tomorrow's episode. I do want to talk about the various RFAs, the restricted free agents that the Falcons have. And, given all the speculation about Drew Dalman's impending departure, what does that mean for someone like a Ryan Nuzul as well as others? Since that will be also something that we can get into potentially tomorrow. And of course, at some point the Falcons are going to make some roster moves, make some salary cap cuts. And so this time of year is always tough because I record a podcast, and all I know in the 30 minutes since I began talking on this show, they've made some roster moves, and I have to go back and re-record these things. So this is my struggle that I deal with during this time of year, but I will power through it, and I hope you guys continue to power through it with me as everydayers by subscribing and following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So check out tomorrow's episode. Check out your second listen being Locked On NFL Draft, where Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson are going to give you still the lowdown on all things combine, who's hurting themselves, who's geared for a big draft night, all that and more. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.